tangata te turaki atu ki tangata tai, ka hura tangata tai te turaki atu ki tangata. Pera hoki rā, te kōrepe nui, te kōrepe roa, te wāhi awa, te toitoi awa. Whakamaua tamaki te ara, whakamoe tamaki te ara, no tū no rongo, whanno, haramai te toki. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Ai te iwi nau mai rā ki tēnei whare kōrero o tātou e mihi ana ki te wāhi ngaro, te tīmatanga me te whakaotinga o ngā mea katoa. A koutou rā, te hunga mate ki a koutou haere whakaoti atu rā. Hoki mai no rā ngā rārangi kōrero ki a tātou kua hau mai ki tēnei whare kōrero, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. And kia ora and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Help Me Breathe, the RSV Epidemic. My name is Kauti Waitford and it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the team. Today's webinar is hosted by a Better Start National Science Challenge, Cure Kids and the Paediatric Society of New Zealand. A Better Start National Science Challenge is a national collaborative research program working to help children achieve the best possible start in life. Its mission is to find practical, evidence-based solutions that make a measurable difference for tamariki, specifically in the areas of healthy weight, successful learning and mental health and resilience. Cure Kids is New Zealand's largest independent funder of paediatric research. For more than 50 years, it has enabled research designed to transform the health of children in Aotearoa, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands by advancing scientific knowledge, improving medical care and discovering cures for diseases. And the Paediatric Society of New Zealand is a not-for-profit charitable organisation that works collaboratively with other societies, government departments and institutions with similar goals to create a better New Zealand for tamariki and rangatahi. Today, you'll hear from 3 top health researchers about the latest on the RSV epidemic in New Zealand, our progress towards a vaccine, and the long-term risks of RSV in Aotearoa. Before we start our webinar, a bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, including Q&A. The webinar will be recorded and loaded onto our websites so that you can listen again later or share with others. All audience members will be automatically muted throughout the session, and there will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar today. Please submit questions using the Q&A function located at the bottom of the Zoom window, not the chat box that we may all be used to using. So the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and feel free to upvote questions submitted by others, and our team will field those questions to our speakers. Our chairs today are Professor Wayne Cutfield, the Director of Better Start National Science Challenge, and Professor Stuart Dalziel, Cure Kids Chair of Child Health Research. So Professors Wayne and Stuart, welcome to you both, and I hand the rākau to you.
Kia ora Kawati, thank you. Today's webinar is going to be a really interesting webinar in that RSV has been overshadowed by COVID and influenza, yet it remains the most common lower respiratory tract infection in children. And really, there's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, as we'll hear from Emma, about RSV over the last few years. We've got 3 experts with 3 different perspectives to bring to you today. Our first speaker, Emma Best, is a paediatric infectious diseases specialist at Starship and a senior lecturer in the Department of Paediatrics. She's also part of the Immunisation Advisory Centre, and research interests are around vaccine preventable diseases. Emma's topic today is an overview of the RSV epidemic in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The floor is yours, Emma.
Kia ora tātou, ko Emma tōku ingoa. He paediatrician aho I Waipapa tō Matarau. I work at the university, also at Starship Children's Health and for the Immunisation Advisory Centre. And at the moment I can't see my slides, but I'm going to work to talk through RSV, what it means for Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what's happened in recent years. So when I get control of the slides, I'll move forward to my first slide. And there I am. And so that's the overview of what I'll be talking about. And just to start, some background, really the 101 of respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, a very common respiratory virus with seasonal spread through winter and early spring, so that by the age of 3 years, most children have had this infection, and they can have repeat infections throughout their lifespan. Not very common to have the infection twice within 1 season, but certainly can have it more than once. The virus is shed in our nasal secretions, and it can be for weeks after the infection, although you're most infectious around that first week of the infection. It spreads from the upper airways through droplets from the nose and throat, coughing, sneezing, and it spreads down to the lower respiratory tract. So here's an image, a cartoon image from Kids Health, a fabulous website with information showing the virus, how it acts in those very small airways in young infants. The virus induces inflammation from spreading from the upper airways down to the lower respiratory tract. And that inflammation and obstruction and mucus blocks those airways, those little airways in little children. So the RSV is the virus, and bronchiolitis is what paediatricians know as the disease. What's bronchiolitis? It's fever. It's a syndrome of fever, cough, fast breathing, extra effort when the baby's breathing, what we call retraction. The chest is moving with effort of breathing. And we can hear with the stethoscope wheezing and crackles in the chest. Bronchiolitis is typically worst around the 3rd day of the illness and lasts around a week, maybe 10 days. And after bronchiolitis, the cough can go on for weeks afterwards. So bronchiolitis is caused predominantly by RSV, and it's a leading cause of hospitalisation in that first year of life around the world. We don't have care other than supportive care, so giving babies fluids via a nasogastric tube, oxygen through nasal prongs, and sometimes care for those stop breathing spells or apnea. Antibiotics are not useful. This is a viral infection, and bronchodilators that you might think of with regards to asthma when a child is wheezy are also not useful in bronchiolitis. But most infants recover. A few can be very critically unwell and need intensive care, and a very few will also die in New Zealand. Some have a recurrent wheeze and cough, and others have permanent airway damage. And we've only got one preventative treatment and no universal immunisation. And I've kind of summarised what the information is for the next hour. So that's unfortunately the takeaway messages. But how important is RSV? Well, this large study from low-income countries across Africa, multiple sites, and Asia looked at 4,000 children under the age of 5 and tried to look at what was causing their very severe and severe pneumonia in those children. And RSV came out on top as a cause in low and middle-income countries as the leading cause of very severe and severe pneumonia or bronchiolitis type illnesses in that age group. And yes, it's the same for us amongst the high-income countries. So here's data from the United States, another paper from Germany showing that RSV actually causes a large burden of hospitalizations in our young children. And there's deaths every year in the United States from children from RSV, showing that RSV is actually a higher risk for our infants than influenza, a virus that we commonly vaccinate against. This is data from the Shivers study, which is a large multidisciplinary group that worked in New Zealand, looking at the epidemiology of what caused what we call severe acute respiratory infections across all age groups, including children. And this publication shows that through 2012, 13, 14, 15, with New Zealand data, that RSV in the dark line caused a large proportion of these severe acute respiratory hospitalizations each season and each winter amongst children up to the age of 5. They could work out about 40% of all of our acute respiratory hospitalizations in young children were due to RSV. And even within that first year of life, there's a higher risk the younger you are, with how likely you are to be hospitalized with acute respiratory infection from RSV. So when they compared these children for age 2 to 5 years with the very youngest groups, those who are 0 to 3 months had a 27 times higher risk of being hospitalized with RSV compared with a child who was aged 2 or 3. Similarly, that risk was high at 3 to 6 months, at 6 to 12 months, and in the under 2-year-olds, and also a significantly higher hospitalization rate amongst Māori and Pacific children. And who experiences that very severe or critical RSV? Those children that need intensive care support and long hospitalizations. Well, we know it's the children who are born premature, those born less than 32 weeks, and those that have lasting chronic lung disease in their first year of life due to being born premature. Also, children with severe congenital heart disease have a risk of having very severe and critical RSV. For Aotearoa New Zealand, that's very important in the context that we know that our Māori and Pacific women are more likely to have premature or extremely premature infants. And we also know that amongst congenital heart defects, although the rates aren't different across ethnicity, that Māori and Pacific whānau are less likely to access surgical interventions and may have lower survival rates with that compared with non-Māori Pacific infants. How about how big is RSV for big people? Well, I'm only going to briefly touch on this because I'm a paediatrician, but to say that actually seasonal RSV is a very important cause of hospitalisation and severe disease against elderly and immunocompromised as well, and those who have cardiac or lung disease. And in what we might call a low flu season in previous years, RSV was actually a more important cause of death amongst the elderly than the circulating seasonal influenza. So what about costs? Well, this fabulous Shivers data that shows the New Zealand specific context amongst children hospitalised in Auckland with acute respiratory infection over 3 years, over 5,000 hospitalisations needed due directly to RSV, over 400 needing intensive care, and the actual RSV confirmed hospitalisation cost being $2.5 million to Auckland each season. And as you can imagine, not just the direct costs, but the very important indirect costs that happen when we have a serious illness from RSV. Here's a study from the United States talking about preterm infants who had RSV, the impacts on their family with regards to stress, poor health, the loss of productivity for that family, disruption of family routine, transport to bigger centres for the need for intensive care. So really lasting indirect impacts on whānau when children are hospitalised with RSV. But what's happened recently? We know we've had this pandemic and the Southern Hemisphere has been essentially closed due to our COVID measures. So in particular, the very strict border controls and quarantining have actually stopped our circulating seasonal respiratory viruses. We know both influenza and RSV. So that in 2020, we saw a massive reduction in RSV. And that's shown best here in this data again from Adrian Trentham, who's going to speak next, talking about what happened in South Auckland with acute respiratory infections in children under the age of 2, peaks that happened every single season. Suddenly in 2020, those proven RSV lab detections, normally 300, 200, 300 each year, were only 2 in 2020. But we knew that wasn't going to last. And when we looked across at Australia, when they opened their borders in Perth or Western Australia, which had similarly very strict border controls, when they opened their borders to the rest of Australian states in their summertime in the end of 2020, they had a large rebound effect with RSV. So here's their usual RSV happening over 2012 to 2019 in the weeks over winter. And when they opened their borders in 2020, having had absolutely no RSV, they suddenly got RSV spread from other states in Australia. And we knew what that would mean for New Zealand. As soon as we opened in April 21, our borders last year to Australia, we became very worried, and here we are, some of the paediatricians talking about what we were expecting to see, and that's in June 2021. And I think we all remember the media and attention around the middle of winter last year. We suddenly saw a huge surge of RSV after it was reintroduced into New Zealand, and yes, general practices, hospitals, flat tack, and we, as a paediatrician, I certainly remember it very well, a very busy time. And the type of surging RSV cases we saw were dramatically more than had been seen previously. So here's the average number of cases just demonstrated in this stuff graphic and what was being seen across all age groups in 2021. So the winter with RSV in 21 in Aotearoa, New Zealand was a peak 5 times higher than had been seen previous to 2020. There was a very sudden and intense pressure on intensive care in hospitals for staff and family with their own illness, elective surgery cancellations and intra-hospital spread. And primary care, who saw the vast majority of this, also had to defer care and were inundated. And this is an excellent commentary written by Cameron Grant and others from the University of Auckland and Adrian Trentham and ESR, who look at the RSV patterns, showing this sort of evidence of an immune deficit. So along the bottom, we've got the age groups and the usual numbers of cases of RSV seen. But you can see that each age group, including those 2 to 5-year-olds, actually had many more cases of RSV in 2021 because they hadn't had it in the year before. And that taught us we need to learn from this, and some of the lessons and learnings from this are around how viruses rebound. And actually, interestingly, the Australians have looked very closely at the genomics of RSV in their rebound time in 2020 and 2021. And previously, this very genetically diverse genome of RSV has actually been very diverse, but we've had a major collapse in the lineages. And so that only these two distinct subtypes of RSV, subtype A, went on to cause these large interseasonal outbreaks. And we don't really know what that will mean with this genetic collapse that's happened in RSV. So we don't have numerous types circulating. And I think the lessons are very clear for the influenza season, that we do see quick rebound of the respiratory pathogens when they're reintroduced, and they give quite unseasonal or very severe outbreaks. That we have this increased pool of susceptibles to RSV infection, giving larger outbreaks. And what's this impact when we have an increased age of infection? It didn't lessen the hospital burden, but longer term will the impact be different? And we don't really know how long it will be before this normal winter seasonality and peaks and troughs will return for RSV, having interrupted the cycle so clearly in 2020 and 2021. I'm just going to briefly touch on treatment and prevention of RSV. As I said, we have very few direct acting agents to prevent or treat this infection, but we do have the use of antibodies for passive immunisation and the active immunisation that you'll hear more about from the next speaker. But I want to really stress the prevention of the consequences of viral respiratory tract infections are incredibly important, and co-infections. And we do see, and I certainly see, bacterial secondary infections that may need antibiotic treatment, but also can be prevented by vaccines, including a pneumococcal vaccine that's routine on our schedule, the Haemophilus vaccine that's routine on our schedule. We actually see meningococcal disease as a consequence of RSV infection when that barrier is broken by a virus. And we also know the co-infections with influenza can be prevented by influenza vaccination. But we do have this passive immunisation product. It's called palivizumab or Synagis. It's a humanized immunoglobulin, a recombinant antibody. So that's the antibody there. It's binding the F protein on the virus surface, the RSV, and preventing the RSV from fusing to the cell membrane and infecting the cell. It's an expensive product, but it can be given by an intramuscular injection each month during the winter seasons, given to very high-risk infants to prevent them from getting RSV. And actually, when it's given to these infants, it does reduce hospitalisation and reduce intensive care admissions for those individuals who receive this as a prophylaxis. It hasn't been funded in New Zealand until now, but it's internationally recommended and used in many jurisdictions in other high-income countries across the world. And just as an example, this is a sort of summary table of numerous countries in Europe and how they fund and deliver this as prophylaxis and which groups they choose. So they might choose the very extremely premature infants in the first year of life. They might choose some that are moderately premature, or those that are even just slightly premature, or have severe lung disease, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, or congenital heart disease, or severe immune deficiency. So there's sort of varying types of guidelines across different countries, but most of them will protect those very premature infants. And as I said, New Zealand hasn't had this funded until now. So it's one little step forward in RSV control that we actually do have this now funded for eligible patients, any infants aged under 1 year who are born at less than 28 weeks gestation, or born at less than 32 weeks but have evidence of lung disease, or are Māori and Pacific, or have a very significant congenital heart defect. But unfortunately, that really is just a band-aid for RSV, a very small band-aid for a very big problem. So this is my summary in the short term, the future. A very common respiratory viral infection, a very common cause of healthcare use, hospitalisation and critical illness in infants, especially those with very high risk conditions, including prematurity, heart and lung. It disproportionately affects our Māori and Pacific whānau in New Zealand. And this recently, our COVID pandemic restrictions have made RSV seasonality and severity unpredictable and uncertain, I think. We have only supportive treatment, and prevention strategies are really limited at the moment. So it's our most important viral target for a vaccine right now, I would say. And what is happening right now, this is just data from the national surveillance showing all hospitalisations for severe acute respiratory illness. This is pink, 2022. You can see normally we have a flu season, but this year we're having a really bad flu season. Last year, almost nothing. Last year RSV, and the year before, almost nothing. And this is almost all attributable at the moment to influenza. But where's RSV? Yes, I was on call last weekend and I can tell you for sure RSV has arrived. We had positive RSV detections in hospital for the first time in this season. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Emma, for that fantastic walkthrough in terms of where RSV epidemic is currently in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as someone who also works clinically in the emergency department, I can certainly attest to the fact that RSV is here, and we're likely to very quickly see the uptake that you were talking about. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Adrian Trentham. Adrian is well known to people in the paediatric community. He's the general paediatrician at Middlemore Hospital and a senior lecturer in the Department of Paediatrics here at the University of Auckland. Adrian's research interests for a very long time now have been lower respiratory tract infections in infants and young children, including a focus on RSV and bronchiolitis. Adrian has been an investigator and an author on RSV maternal immunisation trials, and Adrian's going to talk about that exact topic. So RSV vaccination and where we're heading to. Adrian.
Kia ora, everyone. You can hear me, Stuart?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So thank you for allowing me to talk. As I say, I very proudly come from Kids First in South Auckland and the University of Auckland. I want to talk about RSV, which has been my scourge since starting at Middlemore in 1985. I just want to overview the RSV Virus Basics, but thank you, Emma, has done a lot of that, and the monoclonal antibodies. Then the vaccine that killed, the maternal vaccine that worked a bit, what's happening with modelling, what our current scene is with the vaccine and monoclonals really, and the future, a few comments. First, I want to say Vale Denny, who's my co-investigator with the Novavac maternal vaccine study and had died untimely a number of years ago. Vale Denny. This slide says it all to me. I can see myself, I'm very close to this, and I have a moko, so it's very representative of my current life. And you can see this is really the spectrum of disease and immunity. And the thing in the middle says partial protection from RSV reinfection. This is a lifelong. The immune system doesn't quite know how to handle RSV and totally get rid of it. In this early stage, we get bronchiolitis, as Emma has said, but there we rely on the transfer of maternal antibodies and an immature innate immunity, an immature Th1 immunity, but a definite Th2 bias, which is pro-inflammatory and probably explains a lot of the severe disease here. We then move into this recurrent wheeze phase, exacerbation of asthma, colds, and this partial protection phase. And then when we get to the elderly, declining immunity, and we get more severe disease again. So this is a nice spectrum of disease, but this is where the big burden is and what we've seen at Middlemore for many years. To explain this, this is RSV infection, and obviously viral load plays a part. We have the innate immunity, which improves with age and declines with age. We have a very protective sort of antibody and Th1 response, but we also have an inflammatory Th2 response, which makes the disease worse and actually is part of the severity of disease. And that's explained in the first vaccine trial there was. The virus itself, we're all familiar with spike proteins now, aren't we? So the F protein is the target. This is a stable protein as opposed to the G protein, which varies a lot. So the stable F protein, which facilitates fusion of the virus to the host cell, is the target for the monoclonal antibodies and the vaccines, and we'll talk more. But there are other targets in this RSV virion, and the G protein is looking a little more promising these days. But that's in essence what we're targeting, the fusion protein. So this is what it looks like. So here's, it exists in two states, or really three, but the pre-fusion state, this is an unstable state, and a post-fusion state. And you can see the antigenic sites or epitopes are probably clear in the pre-fusion state. But of course, when you're making a vaccine, it's hard to keep this unstable form available for antigenic stimulation. So you can see here is the epitope for palivizumab and mirtazumab, which wasn't more effective than palivizumab. and other, epitopes here and here, which are more obvious in the pre-fusion state than the post-fusion state, and thus the target for the modern vaccines. And a lot of this work preceded the COVID work in terms of understanding the structure of virus proteins. So thank you, Emma. I just mentioned that, palivizumab works, it's worked for a long time. But it's expensive. Many countries have it, and I was really interested in, this study in Ontario where using this reduced social inequity because the people who got it were the disadvantaged people. But there is a more modern version. I'll mention it now, nirsevimab, which is once per season, so it's modified, so it's one injection per season, which is fantastic. We're trying to implement palivizumab at the moment, and people don't want to give an injection every month. And this, is a recent publication in New England Journal in the premature 29 to less than 35 weeks, 70% efficacy against medically attended LRI. And in the lower risk, 75% efficacy against the LRI and 62% against hospitalization. So in the future, this is probably an answer to the monoclonal. Of course, who gets it is another question. I just want to mention immunoprophylaxis that didn't work. We've been involved in all these studies of monoclonals, and Regeneron was good. I call it the Trump treatment because he got that. This failed, and the B-type RSV actually mutated the epitope during the study, and actually the children did slightly worse with the Regeneron monoclonal. So there's a real lesson, and I think we've got to keep an eye on that for the monoclonal development. I don't know how you feel at the moment, but that's how I feel. We did all we could, but the paperwork was too much. So why we've known about RSV since the 50s and 60s, how come we haven't got a vaccine? And I think there's one very good reason. A study in 1968 of a formalin inactivated vaccine gave enhanced disease in children who are RSV naive. 80% of the participants ended up in hospital with bronchiolitis and 2 died. And this is something Emma's very familiar with. It's a vaccine-associated enhanced viral disease, which also occurs in measles. And it's sort of due to the lack of neutralizing antibodies, the Th2 predominant response, immune complexes, and the lack of T regulatory, activity. And, it is a real concern with vaccines as we go forward. So the WHO have stated great caution in children who are RS naive and have non-replicating vaccines. So I think this has hung over RSV vaccine development since the 60s, and everyone's been very, very cautious about this. This slide is complex, but it's simple. So you've got maternal immunization as a possibility, and infant immunization with the replicating vaccine, so you avoid that hypersensitivity. And if you did maternal vaccine and this is the passive immunity going down, and then this would meet here and come here. So you have a protective antibody titer, although that isn't definitively known, this is a theory. And you can see without maternal vaccine, this is the disease, and with maternal vaccine only, you get this disease. So it's really, I think if you want to properly protect the first 2 years, it's going to have to be a combination of maternal and infant. It's a bit like influenza. So the types of RS vaccine in development, they do include mRNA, because I know everyone's interested in that. The fusion protein, I've mentioned mainly pre-fusion, the G protein. And most of them are subunit vaccines to be for maternal passive or individual active, for the elderly, for mothers, and mothers give passive transfer of antibody, of course, which overcomes that risk of a reaction to the vaccine. There are virus vectors such as adenovirus. There is an mRNA vaccine now in phase 3 trials, and there's a live modified, which is a replicating virus getting over that overreaction. But again, everyone's very wary in the RSV naive infant. This is a snapshot, thanks to PATH, of where we are. And this is live attenuated in phase 2, protein-based inactivated particle subunit. 2 phase 3s, and these are in New Zealand. Pfizer and Glaxo in maternal vaccine. However, the GSK vaccine has been halted with a safety query. So I don't think there's any further recruitment in that. If you go down to the mRNA, I understand that has got to phase 3 now. And so that's been fast tracked. The adenovirus and others and the antibody studies are in phase 3. So it's always a slight concern here. So I just want to mention the Novavac study, which was a huge trial we were involved in. And in the first year, we were the biggest enrollers in the world, really. And, you know, nearly 5,000 women were involved. And what happened, it had a primary endpoint. It had to be more than 40% effective, but had very high standards around that. And it didn't reach those. So was not approved as a vaccine. The interesting thing on that study was it was done in Africa and the US, and it seemed to be very much more effective in Africa, very much more, and marginally effective in the US. And there was never certainty about why that was, whether it was trial design or not. The trial was closed early, I think probably more financial and other reasons, and there were low background rates, so that you know, it wasn't possible to say whether it was effective in Africa because it wasn't designed that way. Interestingly, there was a big signal it had effects on other respiratory outcomes such as pneumonia and later respiratory disease, which will be interesting for the future. And it did define the outcomes that you need to use in RSV studies. And the point about RSV studies is we don't have a definitive antibody level which signifies immunity. So you still have to have clinical trials with RSV infection as the endpoint, which is very intensive and very expensive. I just wanted to reflect, this is from 2002 with many people still active in the game. When we analysed palivizumab and said, yes, it was a priority for kiddies discharged on home oxygen with chronic lung disease who were extremely premature, but of course it wasn't funded. NAM, who did most of the RSV studies for Shivers, actually looked at modeling what would happen if we got a maternal vaccine. So a vaccine effective at 40 to 50% for the first 90 days and then 20 to 30 for the next 90 days would reduce RSV hospitalizations by these, 30 to 40%, and and some effect in the older children, and a seasonal monoclonal antibody would be reduced by this, so slightly more effective, and that gives some idea of the relative effectiveness of each strategy. So I just wanted to mention things about the future in New Zealand. It's likely we'll have palivizumab for at least a season or two, which has been great. Thank you, Pharmac, for listening. The once a season, this semimab, and really depends on the cost, doesn't it? And and whether we just use it for high risk and expanded high risk, or who, I don't know. Maternal vaccine, if it comes, is it just going to be high risk or routine? And will it be cost effective? And it probably won't be available for 2 or 3 years. And then that maternal infant vaccine combination, that's a long way away. But when it does come, we've got double cost, haven't we, in cost effectiveness? And I think we need more work on the cost burden of RSV. We've got medical burden, but we don't have societal burden. But this is an equity issue. I mean, RSV is not a problem for my kids. And, it's more in Pacific, but it does impact old white guys. So I'm really hoping this will bring it to priority once it's affecting old white guys like me. Sorry, that is, irony. I think one of the key issues is the big thing is whatever we do, even if we get a really effective vaccine, there are barriers for more in Pacifica. We've seen that with COVID, and this whole area needs investment to make anything that comes along workable. I mean, we've had it for 20 years, haven't used it. We are using it now. Lockdown, really effective, but we can't do that all the time. Immunisation's cheap against fixing poverty, we all know that. And, we've still got this situation where influenza vaccine is not routinely available to children compared with the rest of the world, many places. And, you know, we know this high risk eligibility stuff really doesn't work in the way our system works. So we need to have routinely available, you know, blanket rather than high risk eligibility. It doesn't work. And I still don't know why, overall, why Miriam Subiga get it so badly. I've seen locally. But lastly, this is the only RSV I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And that was a truly wonderful overview of RSV treatment and prevention. And from what you've shared with us, for those of us looking forward optimistically, vaccination and effective vaccination may be on our horizon, whereas it wasn't just a few years ago for the reasons you've outlined. Just to remind people that if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A and we will deal with them right at the end of the presentations. The presentations have been great, and I'm sure there are questions that will come. Our next speaker, Associate Professor Kaz Burns from the Department of Paediatrics and the University of Auckland, is one of our senior respiratory physicians at Starship Hospital, and her interest has been bronchiectasis and cystic fibrosis for many, many years. Kaz is going to address the long-term consequences of RSV and how it impacts long-term on lung function. Over to you, Kaz.
Kia ora tātou. Ko Ngāti Rakawa ki te tonga te iwi, ko Kaz Burns tāku ingoa. So yes, switching to the longer term outcomes of RSV infection, and by that it's predominantly those who are hospitalised with RSV, which is about 3% of the total children who get RSV in their first 1 to 2 years of life. So this concept of having an early, both a sort of lower respiratory tract infection and early RSV as part of that, causing later ongoing respiratory morbidity is not new, and was first mooted in a study from the 1950s. And the types of diseases that we're talking about is the development of preschool wheeze, the development of childhood asthma, protracted bacterial bronchitis, which is a wet cough, but that doesn't go on to necessarily to give bronchiectasis, and also the specific chronic lung disease of bronchiectasis. And there's been over 300 studies looking at these sort of trajectories. So this is a, excuse me, a meta-analysis of 20 studies, looking at early RSV infection and what happens subsequently up to the age of 5 and some, and 12 and others. And it gives, they give an odds ratio between 3 and 36 for subsequent development of preschool wheeze, and 3 and 17 for subsequent development of asthma. And in the studies that measured it, an increased viral load and disease severity are associated with a higher risk of ongoing respiratory trouble. Infants particularly at risk, which is what Emma had also mentioned, is the premature infants, children with chronic lung disease, congenital heart disease, or the immunocompromised. But if you're looking at the absolute burden of RSV, the main impact is on previously healthy infants in terms of numbers. So in a review of 41 studies, these are all prospective and have been stratified by age. So those that studied up to 3 years of age, those that studied up to 5 years of age, and those that studied for longer. And they compared 3 groups: RSV versus no respiratory infection, RSV versus rhinovirus, or RSV versus any other viral infection. And you can see here that in up to 3 and older, there was an increase in odds ratio for developing preschool wheeze. It became less a factor as the children grew. And they also had increased odds ratio for ultimately developing childhood asthma. Of these comparisons, there was no difference between the RSV and rhinovirus, and the only other positive was RSV versus other viruses, where RSV gave you a slightly higher odds ratio of developing asthma. This is a massive study using insurance company data in the States. So they looked retrospectively over 15 years, and each year they took children who were less than 1 admitted with RSV infection and followed them for the next 5 years. And they did that repeatedly with all these cohorts. And what you can see is the huge number that are involved in the studies. And also that length of hospitalisation was definitely greater in RSV compared to the non-RSV respiratory infections. And then your subsequent event-free time was much less with RSV. So your time to wheeze was much more common if you had an RSV infection over time and up to 5 years of age. And what was counted was at least 3 wheezy episodes in a single 12-month period. So the World Health Organization held a workshop, and this is a report from it in 2020, and they were really looking at trying to tease out, is there an association with RSV and later wheeze or wheezy illnesses, or is it causal? And they came down saying the causal side of it hasn't actually been ultimately proven, but definitely there's an association. And so an association really means that there is the potential for pre-existing determinants that will both increase a child's risk for getting RSV infection and getting it badly, and then an increased risk for getting asthma without one necessarily leading to the other. So these predeterminants can be genetic, so there's shared gene markers for both atopy, for risk of RSV, for later asthma. It can be structural, such as smaller airways, and this is in keeping with, for example, premature infants, where the males tend to have smaller airways and therefore have more respiratory disease in their early days. Or it can be something in the environment that means that you are vulnerable to both. So smoke exposure in utero, or the household, or a crowded household, or siblings or daycare attendants, meaning you're much more exposed to viruses early. But there is some studies that would suggest causal. So, for example, mice infected with RSV continued to have wheeze long after the clearance of the virus, and they developed an asthma histology, which was different to the mice that were not infected with RSV. Also, early RSV infection impairs T cell function. So in early neonates, your ability to mount a Th1 response, which is the response you need to clear microorganisms, is not that fantastic. And so quite often they'll start dragging up their Th2, which is the atopic response, to try and help clear whatever infection they've got. And then that may persist. And also in more recent studies, looking at nasal microbiome, there were patterns of nasal microbiome during RSV infection that then went on to lead to higher risk of developing later preschool wheeze or asthma. And it was different to another pattern of microbiome where the children didn't go on to get those issues. Now, there might be some other things at play here, and one of them could be the virus itself. So we've got used to this genotyping. We haven't done it very often with RSV, but we're very used to it with COVID and with influenza. And although we've got 2 major types, there are a number of subtypes. And there is a suggestion that certain subtypes may be more virulent or lead to more downstream effect, including wheezy episodes. Now, we heard from Emma that, in fact, the range of RSV has collapsed, and we're just down to a couple, certainly for last year, as it came in from Australia. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens and whether they're particularly virulent or not. Now, it could also be the timing. So this is a study looking at 7 countries. They looked at RSV admission rates. This is the less than 1 year of age. And there was a range of 60 to 120 per 1,000 children that required admission, which was less when you were older. This is the 1 to 4s. And there's more like 20 to 40 per 1,000 children that required admission. But in follow-up, it tended to be this group that got more of the wheezy illnesses. And of course, it could be a combination of one or more viruses or bacteria. And if you look here, here's RSV, but there's parainfluenza rhinovirus and a number of bacteria. So these are associated with asthma development, and these have been associated with asthma exacerbations. So it could well be a combination. And interestingly, there is only one, Helicobacter pylori, that is actually protective against the development of asthma. Some of the studies that haven't been consistent with reducing this early RSV infection and later wheeze has been looking at the pilavimab monoclonal antibody studies. So where you've prevented RSV in the very young, and then what happens subsequently. And in fact, there's been pretty inconsistent findings. This is just one which shows this is the treated group, this is the untreated group. Yes, there was more wheezy illnesses in the untreated group, but it wasn't massive. the funny thing is, it depended whether you were atopic to start with. So this is the treated group who developed wheeze, untreated, or non-atopic, which seems quite a stretch, and I don't know how to explain it. You can see, however, this is another study, but small numbers. You can see that it definitely stopped hospitalization with RSV infection, and wheezy episodes when they're very young. But by school age, their lung function was the same in both groups. Now, as well as RSV, I've done obviously really interested in bronchiectasis, and this also is suggested that severe lower respiratory tract infection in very early life goes on to cause chronic symptoms with a proportion developing bronchiectasis. And as Adrian alluded to, our Māori and Pacifica, but New Zealand in general, has high rates of these predisposing diseases. So these are a number of studies that we and other colleagues have performed, just following up from early hospitalization for lower respiratory tract infection, reviewing later to show that many carry on to have ongoing symptoms and signs, and a proportion go on to get bronchiectasis. This is not necessarily all RSV. RSV was a proportion of all of these studies. And it doesn't stop there. So early life events can go on to impact adult lung disease. By this, we're talking about later adult asthma, bronchiectasis, and COPD. And you can see in a COPD meta-analysis, all of these were deemed separate risk factors for its later development. And the mechanism by which this can happen is potentially threefold. Either there's a continuation of the disease that's established in childhood, or a prior respiratory disease gives you predisposes to later disease, possibly because of inflammation or a changed microbiome or a changed immune response, or reduced maximum attainment of lung function, which occurs in your between 18 and 20 years of age. And after that, there is a decline. So the potential is you have early respiratory disease, and either you have an early decline once you've reached your peak, or you never get to your peak. And so you're having a reduction from a lower level. This is a really excellent study that was published a couple of years ago. And this is involving over 120,000 adults looking at their lung function and then following them up for 8 years and across many communities in 17 countries, and also of note, a range of high, middle and low income countries, because so often what we talk about is come from high income countries. And they divided this group into those with no lung function impairment, so an FEV1 of 112% predicted, mild, with around 91% predicted. And let me tell you, we wouldn't bat an eyelid at this number in clinic. We consider this normal. Moderate impairment, 70% predicted, and then severe, which is less than 50%. And then they followed them for the next years. And what became apparent was that FEV1 or FVC alone predicted your all mortality. So this is the unimpaired group, mild, moderate, and severe. And it predicted it in, across the board in cardiovascular, in respiratory, cardiovascular events, respiratory admissions. And what makes this even more interesting is that they then looked at the population attributable risk for death and for each of those parameters. And so firstly, I've just highlighted here that the mild to moderate impairment gave an attributable risk for death of 24%, which is so much greater than the sort of things you would think would give you a much higher risk factor. So the severe is low because there's low numbers here. And then tobacco use, heart disease, or hypertension, no, your FEV1 was a more powerful marker. And similarly, looking at cardiovascular disease, 17% attributable to your FEV1, And the only one that surpasses this, despite other risk factors that we collect when we're looking for issues, is hypertension. And although obviously the most severe do have a higher risk of dying over the next years, but because of the sheer numbers, the population risk was much larger in the mild and moderate impaired adults. So in summary, RSV and also lower respiratory tract infection in general, mostly that gets you into hospital, will go on to develop a chronic lung disease in childhood. And what we're largely talking about here is preschool wheeze, asthma, and bronchiectasis. But either by association, be it genetic, structural, or environmental, or by causal, so either because of the host response, a changing immune pattern, or altering the microbiome. And it doesn't stop there. Again, in adults, chronic lung disease of asthma, COPD, or bronchiectasis, again, can be impacted by early childhood RSV and or lower respiratory tract infection, either by changing the lung function trajectory, predisposing to a secondary respiratory disease, or just a continuation of that first disease. So we've had this explosion of RSV last year, and we're going to have an explosion of influenza this year. And so it will be, so will we have an explosion of preschool wheeze and asthma in the next couple of years to come? Thank you.
Kaz, thank you very much for that fantastic walkthrough in terms of the long-term effects of RSV infection. So this afternoon, from all three speakers, we've really had a fantastic summary, I think, of the science around RSV. Emma talking about the burden of disease. 1 in 13 children in their first year of life in this country present to hospital or are admitted to hospital with bronchiolitis. Adrian certainly gave us some hope with the future in terms of strategies around immunisation. And finally, I think what Kaz reminded us of is this is not just a burden for the very young. It's a burden for children as they continue through childhood and into the future, into adulthood as well. And that's really why it is such an important topic. So I'd like to open the floor up to questions. Please use the question and answer function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And the first question comes from Dunedin, and Mavis is asking, children aged 3+ can finally access influenza vaccine from Friday of this week. So I think she's reminding us that Pharmac have actually opened that up to children from 2 to 12 years of age to access influenza vaccine this season. And her question, and I'll probably put this to Emma, the reason for restricting vaccine access to children younger than 2 years of age.
Yeah, kia ora, Mavis, and thank you so much for bringing that up, because yes, 3 to 12-year-olds, free influenza vaccine now available. Yes, the formulation is different for those aged 6 months to 35 plus months, so in 6 months to 3 years old, and that supply for that vaccine is not enough to open it up to all. That is correct. However, do remember that we do have enough to vaccinate our 6 months to 3-year-olds. If they've ever had a respiratory hospitalisation, they get a free funded vaccine, or if they've got any kind of medical condition whatsoever that compromises them, they also are entitled to a free flu vaccine. So, yep, it's free for all from the age of 3, but we do have funded vaccines for kids who've got any kind of respiratory illness. And I say, if you've coughed and walked past an emergency department as a toddler, you can have a free flu vaccine, because that's how it's funded. So thanks heaps, Mavis, for reminding us to bring up that really important thing.
Stuart, while we're waiting for some Q&A, I've got 2 questions for our panelists. The first one is, I'm not sure we're free of the shackles of COVID yet, and it is conceivable that we could end up with another variant that ends out somewhat resistant to the current vaccine, and we end up back in some form of lockdown, reduction in RSV rates. So what advice do we give, if we end out in that setting, what advice do we give to families and healthcare providers, knowing that there is going to likely be an ensuing surge in RSV when the lockdown and the borders open up? What advice can we give other than lock your children up at home, which is what most parents are probably thinking? But is there anything we can do to prepare that? My second question is that the access to the monoclonal antibody is for young infants at high risk. But then, as Emma and Adrian both talked about, the elderly are also at risk. And where do they sit in terms of access to the monoclonal? Because that could be a much, much, much bigger group.
I'll have a go at the second question and the first question. So it's never been studied or used in prevention of hospitalisation. So palivizumab, the monoclonal antibody for the elderly. We do actually now use monoclonal antibodies, as you know, for COVID to prevent severe disease. So I guess it's an interesting thought for the way of the future. These things are expensive to manufacture. They are hard to administer because they are injections each season. I mean, much like a vaccine, if they're long acting, that's good. If they're short acting, it's a pain in the butt, literally once a month. So I don't think, I can't really see how they have a role, but yes, why not if it's a long acting one? Really looking at the long-term effects from what Cass has talked about, I still think we have to concentrate on the highest risk in the first 2 years of life. And I still think that they're the ones that we're going to get the best bang for our buck to prevent them from having sequelae for the entire of their lifespan. And that's not saying anything about anyone's grandparents, how important they all are. The other question, we do need to know that we can stop transmission by hand washing, by respiratory hygiene, and the things we have learned so much about in the last year and a half, and masking. Those things actually are likely to lessen our respiratory burden when we're having surges. So other than making sure you're fully vaccinated, that you get your free influenza vaccine if you can, then using those measures still useful.
And I think also the other one is definitely stay home if you're unwell, like especially from from early learning centres, because that's where the kids are sort of largely catching them. And that's been a really strong message, which hasn't really happened so much previously. Also, just with regard to the monoclonals for the older age group, it is weight related and very expensive. So, I mean, so that's the other kind of issue that any funding, would look at, because it will be hugely expensive. I mean, it's really expensive in the kids, even trying to share vials and all the rest of it, as they kind of get a little bit heavier. So for the adults, it'll be way up there.
And one last comment, and then I'll be quiet. Mask wearing in young children is something that hasn't really occurred during COVID. Should we be advocating that if we are concerned about a future RSV epidemic? And of course, can you keep them on, young children?
I think it's impractical, unfortunately. Although I do love that picture that Emma uses with the kid with the mask all the way around here with just the eyes cut out, which is fantastic. So I think impractical, but you can see it was pretty impractical even for the school age kids, because you could see that that's where the COVID Omicron infections were coming from, like or like even like people, colleagues at work and all the rest of it. The ones that were going down with COVID were all the ones that had teenage kids in school.
I think we need to be very careful to talk about schools as transmission sites. I don't think that's quite the right context, because we want to make sure kids get to school and get their education.
Oh, that's true. I'm sorry,
the community of
right.
a school, there's parents, there's many different mixing, and it's the community around a school that, just like our community, is where transmission happens. So we want to, and masks can be worn down to 8 quite well, but there is the issue around communication and learning for very young children wearing masks, as I think Wayne's alluding to.
I might comment. I mean, the people in the bronchiectasis clinic have taught me quite a lot about how families cope with this and what's practical. And they've actually changed the way they interact with families, they socialize, and the use of masks when it's tolerated. And it's surprising how many kids can tolerate it. But I take Emma's point that, education is vital. But the families have learned about hand washing, mask wearing, contact, and particularly contact with people who are unwell or have a respiratory infection. I'm just hoping that people who come through the border who have a cold change their habits too, because that's where it's coming from. I think there's reasonably good evidence now that we get it all from Australia. No, sorry, overseas.
So there are a couple of, thanks for that, Adrian. There are a couple of final questions that I'll just get people to ask quickly. Going forward, is it likely that the influenza vaccine will be funded for all children 3 to 12 years or only just for this year? And also a question about young adults, particularly students living in residential halls and boarding facilities.
So with regards to the flu vaccine, I mean, I've been advocating for flu vaccine in schools prior to COVID, because actually controlling a community flu burden is enabled by vaccinating children. So yes, I would be very hopeful, and I think that would be, you know, around the other countries, under 5-year-olds routinely get influenza vaccine in other jurisdictions. So I think it's something we should be looking to stop hospitalisation burden, and potentially a school flu program to prevent community spread as well. Again, not saying that schools spread flu, but the community does. And with regards to adolescents, well, actually, they're probably amongst the very much lower risk of RSV. And so, and flu consequences. So perhaps they have been less of a, both research for RSV and flu, but I'd be interested in what the others think as well. But importantly, there's a free meningococcal vaccine for those adolescents who live in shared homes.
But we do need access from RM Pacific has come up every time, and you know, this is a separate issue, but vital to this discussion, that has to be part of the equation, because you know, we've got a lot of places where there's effective treatments or preventions, and it's not accessible for our Māori and Pacifica kids.
Thank you very much for that, Adrian. Look, I think that's a really nice point to end on, is that, you know, RSV is a disease of inequity in this country and seriously needs to be looked at. The key things that have come out is that it's certainly a mix of RSV, influenza, and COVID that we are going to need to deal with in the future going forward as well. So I'd like to thank all 3 panelists for their talks, for their time. These presentations will be available on the Better Start website and the Cure Kids website. Any additional questions that have been posted will be answered there as well. So finally, I'd like to hand over to Kawhiti to finally close things for today. Wayne has one more point to make once he takes himself off.
Sorry, can I just, thank you, Stuart. Can I just make one small plug before we hand over to Kawhiti, in that A Better Start, Cure Kids and Paediatric Society will continue with our webinar series. We've got 2 coming up. One is on vitamin D deficiency, how it manifests, how we manage it, and clearly it is a major problem in this country as it is in the developed world. And the other one coming is on diets in children, including vegetarian diets. Are they healthy? What adjustments need to be made for those children to grow and thrive? So they're coming. Advertisements will follow. Thank you. Kawhiti.
Tēnā tātou, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for all of your time. And yeah, look forward to the next webinar coming soon. Nā reira, runga I tērā, ka kapita tātou hui, te ra kia unuhia te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia māmā te ngākau, te tinana te wairua, te rataka tū, ko ia rai rongo whakairi ake ki runga kia tīna, haumi e hui e tāi ki e. Kia ora tātou, until next time.